If you asked me what the most confusing system in Terraria is, I would without hesitation say wiring. But I don't think that's due to it being incredibly complicated as much as it is being poorly explained. A month ago, I knew basically nothing about wiring, but everything I've learned in that time since I've put into this video. By the end, you'll know as much as I do, and I've tried to present this in a beginner-friendly way. If you want to learn more or need help, I suggest joining the Discord server linked down below. It's a new server meant to help people learn and share technical aspects of Terraria like wiring, hoiks, and building. Wiring works on a simple concept. Certain objects activate when given a signal. You have three basic components: the place the signal comes from, the wire itself, and the destination. In this case, you flip a switch, it sends a signal down the wire, and the trap activates, shooting a dart. We're going to call anything that sends a signal an input and anything that activates when it gets a signal an output. Input signals are instantaneous. When you send the signal, it activates the connected output immediately, then the signal stops. It's not like Minecraft Redstone where wires can be on and off. Every wiring build, let's call them circuits, boils down to this basic concept. When something happens, like stepping on a pressure plate, it sends a signal to an output and causes some change, like spawning an enemy from a statue. All that changes is how and when the signals come. So how do you send wiring signals? What effects can they have? And how do you get them? Doing any wiring requires the mechanic, who you can free post Skeletron. She sells almost everything you'll need. You can use wrenches to place wires down. Each wrench places a different color of wire. You can use different colors of wire to avoid mixing your signals. Wire automatically connects to any adjacent wire of the same color, which means you can't put two lines of the same wire side by side. They'll connect into one. This teleporter leads to 3 different locations depending on which switch you press. If we used the same color wire, they would all lead to the same destination because they would connect and become one wire. Wires of different colors can also be placed on top of each other without issue. It looks like there are a lot of different wrenches and wiring items, but really you only need to carry one. The grand design can be crafted with one of each wrench, a wire cutter, 60 wire, and a mechanical lens at a tinkerer's workshop, and it just combines all of their functionalities into one item while also letting you place wire at any range by dragging and dropping. You should make one immediately if you want to do any wiring. Wire itself can also be carried in the ammo slot. Use the buttons beside the hotbar up here to turn off the forced wire displays and the mechanical ruler effect if you don't want them. By clicking and dragging, you can place wire in a straight line over any distance. This is our wire placing tool that we'll be using for the rest of the video. The mechanic also sells all sorts of inputs, the items that send activation signals. Levers and switches are furniture you place down. The only difference between them is that levers are bigger. If you right-click it, it sends an activation signal down any wires it connects to. If you click it again, it sends another signal. These are good for things like teleporters and light switches. Essentially, if you want a one-time effect that the player intentionally activates, use a switch or a lever. Pressure plates are similar in the sense that they send a signal once they get activated, but instead of being clicked, they activate when stepped on. She sells all sorts of different color pressure plates, and each one activates under different circumstances. Teal pressure plates uniquely activate when shot by a projectile and can be placed on any part of a wall. There are also weighted pressure plates which send a signal when it's stepped on or stepped off. Those can be crafted like this. If you want to trigger an effect when a player, NPC, enemy, or projectile is in a specific location, pressure plates are your friend. Let's say you want a wall that opens when a player walks up to it. If you put pressure plates on either side, you can run seamlessly through it. The mechanic also sells timers, which send a signal after a certain period of time depending on which timer it is. They don't send one immediately upon activation. Once turned on, they will continue to fire signals until turned off or the world is exited. There's no additional input required. You can turn them on with a right click or with another wiring signal. Timers are what you use when you want an effect to keep happening. If you're farming statues, hook them up to a timer and they'll keep spawning enemies until you turn it off. There are other input methods besides the ones sold by the mechanic as well. Pressure plate tracks are just a pressure plate on a minecart track. Literally, you craft it with any pressure plate and a minecart track. They'll be triggered by players riding minecarts on top of them. Dead man's chests and detonators are found underground and send an activation signal when used. They're not really useful for wiring builds since what they do can be done better with other tools. Trapped chests, meanwhile, are crafted with wire and a chest. These do not have storage inside of them. They are fake chests that send a wiring signal when opened. As you'd expect, they're good for making traps, and unlike Dead Man's chests, you can turn any chest into a trapped chest, not just the gold ones. Gem locks are a very cool furniture that sends a signal when a large gem is placed inside of it or removed from it. They're useful for making custom maps. You could use gems as keys to open an actuator door. Lastly, we have sensors. These are hard mode items that activate under specific conditions, and they're all pretty straightforward. A player above sensor activates when a player is inside the highlighted area above it, a night sensor activates when it becomes night, a day sensor for the day, and a liquid sensor activates when the appropriate liquid is touching them. Player above and liquid sensors also send a signal when they deactivate. Each of the sensors needs to be crafted. These are their recipes. These sensors give you even more freedom for sending signals. You could use an announcement box hooked up to a day sensor to announce when it turns into day, and one for night as well. Player sensors are kinda like weighted pressure plates with a bigger area of effect. Liquid sensors are a bit more niche, but can be useful. Those are all of the possible ways to send an activation signal. Depending on what you're trying to build, you should use an input that matches. Now that we know how to send a signal, what can those signals do? Well, the answer is a lot. Almost any light source in the game can be toggled on and off with a signal. This includes torches, lamps, lanterns, campfires, candles, gemspark blocks, and even heart lanterns. Sending another signal turns them back on. Campfires that turn off this way will remove the buff they provide, but heart lanterns still give the buff regardless of whether they're on or off. Wire can also turn bast statues on and off like campfires. You can buy actuators from the mechanic and place them down by hand or with the grand design. When a signal hits them, they cause whatever block they're on top of to turn off, disabling their collision. And they can affect almost anything. You can make secret passages, turn a wall into a door, cause an area to count as a certain biome by using actuated blocks, and they're incredibly useful for details when building. Sending another signal will turn the block back on. If you destroy the actuator with wire cutters or the grand design while the block is inactive, it'll stay inactive. There are also active stone blocks, which are basically a legacy actuator from before actuators were added into the game. These only exist naturally in boulder traps, and they're functionally pretty useless, but you can shimmer them to get wire pre-boss. This doesn't accomplish much because you can't get the wrenches to place the wire, but you can craft some timers and use naturally occurring wire to do some basic things like farming statues. Doors, including trapdoors and gates, will open and close in response to wire. Note that there are no locked doors that can only open via wiring. You'll want to use actuators for those. Pumps, when activated, will move liquids from an inlet pump to an outlet pump. The pumps need to be connected by wire, and they can be crafted with iron and wire at an anvil. You can use up to 5 pairs of pumps with a single line of wire. This is a great way to move shimmer to a more convenient location. You could use it to flood an area with lava, then drain it. With a liquid sensor, you could make an automated system to do that. If you really want to be fancy, you could make a universal fishing pond and fill it with different liquids depending on your needs. Speaking of liquids, you can also open and close grates with a wiring signal. These are solid blocks that allow liquids to pass through them when open. They're like an inverse bubble block. Conveyor belts will change their direction when they receive a wiring signal. Minecart tracks at spots where the tracks overlap will have the active track switched when a wiring signal comes. All traps can be activated with a wiring signal, but they do have a cooldown before they can be activated again. That cooldown varies from 1.5 seconds to 10 seconds depending on the trap. You can put traps in mob farms wired up to a timer to help kill them faster, but in general, they don't do that much damage to enemies. Most traps do half of their base damage on classic to enemies and don't scale with difficulty, so even though a boulder hits you for 420 damage on master mode, it only does 70 to enemies. The one exception is explosives, which deal 500 damage to everything, but they aren't reusable. Announcement boxes, when activated, send a message in chat. We mentioned using them for time of day messages earlier. In single player, that's about the extent of their usefulness, but in multiplayer, they can be quite fun for messing with your friends. Terraria's text chat has a few hidden features you can take advantage of, and I'll just cover the most fun one here. By starting your message with a bracket, C/, and then a hexadecimal color code followed by a colon, you can change the color of your message, end with another bracket, and the text will automatically update. This can be useful if you want the messages to stand out, or if you're trying to trick other players. The boss summoning hexadecimal code is AF4BFF. You can also make a color gradient by typing the hexadecimal code for a batch of letters. This one is a lot more complex and time-consuming, but we can use it with Unicode characters later to make animations. Check this timestamp for details on that. And, of course, activating a teleporter will cause players, NPCs, and enemies to teleport to the connected teleporter. Using a teleporter is pretty simple. You need to have 2 teleporters, one that you start from and one that you end up at. Connect them with wire and make sure the wire is actually touching the teleporter. Then, give it some input mechanism. Switches, levers, and pressure plates all work well. Note that player above sensors cannot directly activate teleporters. You can use logic gates as a workaround. I talk about those later. Now, you can teleport. They instantly transport you across any distance. You could put them on either side of a large world and still have them function. You can link up bases across the world with teleporters to travel between them immediately. Now, that is basically what pylons do, and those don't need to be connected by wire, but teleporters have the advantage of not needing nearby NPCs, having no limit to the number that can be placed, not needing you to click on the map, and functioning during invasions and boss fights. You can easily connect up to 8 destinations to a single teleporter by placing each color of wire on the left and right blocks. Make sure not to overlap any wires. If a teleporter has multiple possible destinations, it'll take the player to the furthest one. As far as cheesing bosses, teleporters instantly transport you to another area, and boss AI really can't handle that. Duke Fishron's third phase, for instance, can be dodged easily by hooking up 2 teleporters, turning on Smart Cursor, and flipping a switch whenever you see him appear next to you. Teleporters have a range of 4 tiles above them, and that height is maintained during the teleport. This means that whatever you're teleporting doesn't have to be directly on it, and enables a neat one-way teleporter trick. Teleporters can be hammered, and one hammerable state is a half block. Well, the teleporter range will shift half a block downward. If we teleport from a full teleporter to a half teleporter, at the maximum range, you get pushed upwards. This is just high enough that the full teleporter can reach you, but the half teleporter can't. It's a great way to trap enemies. Normally, you accidentally end up teleporting enemies back to the start when you repeatedly use a teleporter. Hoiks can also be an effective way of kicking enemies out of range to prevent teleporting back. And lastly, we have statues. Statue farming is the single most useful application of wiring for normal playthroughs. These statues are an output, and when they get a signal, they spawn an enemy, an item, or have some other effect. You can find statues underground, usually in cabins and mushroom biomes. Let's talk enemies first. These are all of the statues that can spawn enemies. Mimics, crabs, and wall creepers will never drop items. Medusas, pigrons, unicorns, and wraiths will only drop their items in hard mode. For all of these enemies, they have significantly reduced drop rates, and the player needs to deal at least 1 point of damage to them. They can't die solely from lava, traps, or NPCs. Summoning minions does count as dealing damage to them, so typically you'll want to use those. To put it briefly, these statues suck and are basically never worth using. These ones can sometimes be useful, but are usually slower than farming the enemy normally, and these ones are typically going to get you the items faster and safer than regular kills. Slime and zombie statues are unique because they are the only statue enemies that do drop items when killed solely by lava or traps. Slimes also have their normal drop rates. It's not reduced at all. This makes them a very good source of gel and the most feasible way to get a slime staff. If you want an automatic farm for gel and you're on expert mode or higher, do it in pre-hard mode. Once you get in hard mode, the slimes will get much higher HP and you can't just dunk them in a thin layer of lava to quickly kill them. Make sure to stretch out the lava thin enough that it won't burn items. Throw a copper coin in to test. When it comes to actually farming the enemy, you'll want to trap them in a box and attack them from safety. Put a physical damage minion, vampire frogs and flinxes are very good for this, in the box, slap down a thin layer of lava, maybe a trap if you're feeling fancy. Large enemies, unicorns, pigrons, and sharks need additional space to spawn. Specifically, they need width, 6 blocks wide. If you're farming any of these enemies, you need 2 additional statues of space on either side for the enemy to spawn. It's a great spot to put in secondary statues, like granite golems that you can farm for extra value. One last word of warning. Sharks are able to clip through 1 block thick walls when faced with knockback. Statues will stop spawning enemies if there are 3 or more of that enemy within 12.5 tiles, 6 within 37.5 tiles, and 10 anywhere in the world. That means if you can move the enemy away from the statue, such as with a hoik or a one-way teleporter, you can dramatically improve their efficiency. Also, all NPC spawning statues have a cooldown of half a second. Even if you send wiring signals faster, like with a quarter-second timer, they'll still only spawn in every half second. King and queen statues teleport NPCs to them, male and female, respectively. They are not usually very useful, but it can be an easy way to bring NPCs to an area to lower spawn rates and spawn more critters. Lastly, there are 3 statues that spawn item pickups: bombs, mana stars, and hearts. These have slightly different spawn distance rules than enemies. I spent a long time talking about these in my Hoik guide, so check that for more details, but you can essentially use them for free bombs, mana restoration, and HP restoration. Hook up a bomb statue to a timer while you AFK, and hook up heart and mana statues in arenas for some free pickups. Okay, that's all pretty straightforward. You have a bunch of different ways to send an input signal, they activate under different conditions, and you can link them up to different outputs to achieve various effects. If you understand all of that, then you can make some simple circuits. Let's go over a few. I want to make my base safe from enemies during invasions, so I don't have to worry about goblins breaking down my doors. So I'm going to place a line of actuators and a blue pressure plate on either side. When I walk on it, the door opens, letting me walk through. Player above sensors can be used to make sure the door doesn't stay open if you trigger the pressure plate and then walk away. Alternatively, I could echo coat and actuate a block in front of my door. When I press this switch, the invisible boxes turn on and the enemies can't get to the door. The shimmer being all the way across the world is very inconvenient, so let's move it closer. I put a pump inside the shimmer, connect it with wire to my base, and pump it out. I want to teleport a player inside a building I made without ruining the look of things. So I use actuators on the teleporter and echo code it, which makes it invisible and removes the collision. I destroy the actuators, then wire it up to an exit. Now I have a seamless teleport. Anytime you want your wiring builds to blend in, you should consider using echo coatings and actuators to hide them. Make sure to destroy the actuators afterwards. You don't want the wire turning it back on. We saw that teleporters have a range above them earlier. Using that, we can make even more teleporter destinations from a single location. Using a setup like this, with one teleporter actuated and one below, we can connect 20 destinations to one source. I want to delay a wiring signal slightly, so I hook up a dart trap to shoot a teal pressure plate. The input will have to wait for the dart to physically travel the distance. You can also hammer dart traps to change the direction they shoot in. Note that any teal pressure plates need to have at least one block of space before the trap. I could also make the signal hit a timer which loops back to cancel itself. The timer activates. 3 seconds later, it sends a signal. That signal opens the door and causes the dart trap to shoot a pressure plate, turning the timer back off. This is useful for longer delays. I want to send wiring signals faster than every quarter second. Let's say I want to do it every single game tick. The best way to do that is to put an NPC or enemy into an engine where they're constantly sent back and forth and activate pressure plates every game tick. This right here is our engine. It's quite simple. The NPC gets teleported in and gets stuck in a hoik loop where they're getting sent left and right. Every single time that happens, they activate these pressure plates here. I would suggest using NPCs that have had their homes destroyed or target dummies, which can be crafted using hay collected with the sickle purchased from the merchant. The only downside to target dummies is that they'll stop working if you die, and NPCs can be killed by enemies and will teleport home at night if a valid home exists. Whenever you save and quit a world, all wiring gets stopped and shut off. This means that you need to reactivate all of your circuits each time you reload the game. To fix that, we can make what's called a world load detector, a device to send a signal every time the world is loaded. The best way to do that is by using liquid sensors and pumps. Whenever the world is exited, all liquids settle down and stop flowing. If we keep a small amount of liquid permanently looping between two pumps with a timer, like this, it'll only activate this liquid sensor whenever the world is exited and the lava settles. As soon as you load in, it recognizes that it's in lava and starts the timer to begin looping the liquid once more. We use a dart trap because as soon as the liquid leaves the sensor, it'll send another signal, so we need something with a cooldown to avoid activating twice. It's a great way to start up circuits or send a message with an announcement box. If you're building a custom map, you may want to give instructions or information to players when they begin. Be warned that these sensors can break if the game is quickly exited upon being loaded. So that's a lot that we can make, and everything that I've said so far isn't that complicated. It's basic input and output with some creativity thrown in. That changes once we get to logic gates. Right now, all of our wiring operates on a when statement. When the input happens, the output happens. When you step on a pressure plate, you explode. When you click the switch, you teleport. Logic gates add conditional statements to wiring. They are a gate that the signal can't get past unless the conditions are right. So, instead of when you click the switch, you teleport, it becomes when you click the switch and you've shot the pressure plate, you teleport. A logic gate is just a piece of furniture that you buy from the steampunker. On their own, they don't do anything. You need to buy logic gate lamps to customize them. A logic gate can have any number of lamps above it. Well, as many as fit in a world. The lamps turn on and off when they receive a signal, and the gate will activate and send a signal through if the correct number of lamps are lit. It will deactivate and send another signal if that is no longer true. It only sends a signal when it changes from active to inactive. It doesn't actually matter whether the gate is on or off after that. There are 6 different types of logic gates you can buy, and they're mostly the same. Because they send a signal when they turn both on and off, there's really not that much difference between a lot of them. An AND gate activates when every lamp is lit, the first and the second and the third, and so on. An OR gate activates when the first or the second or the third is lit, which just means that any of them are lit. The N-AND and N-OR, meaning not AND and not OR, activate when those gates wouldn't. They're inverse gates. If an AND gate signals when every lamp is lit, a not AND gate signals when not every lamp is lit. An OR gate signals when any lamp is lit, so a NOR gate would activate when no lamps are lit. Lastly, the exclusive gates are a special type of OR gate. An exclusive OR gate activates when only one lamp is lit, and a not exclusive OR gate activates when anything except one lamp is lit, so 0 lamps or anything more than one. Overall, most of these logic gates are not particularly useful, and because they get toggled on and off and send signals both times, it's a little awkward using them. For most of this video, we're just going to be using AND gates. On top of the 6 types of logic gates, there are 3 different types of lamps. An on lamp starts in the on position, and an off lamp starts in the off position. They both toggle on or off when they receive wiring signals. The only difference is their default state. Then we have faulty lamps. These completely override the normal gate and make it blue. The gate can no longer activate normally, and we effectively have a 7th type of logic gate. These faulty logic gates are much more useful than the normal ones. When the faulty lamp receives a wiring signal, it picks a lamp at random below it. If that lamp is on, the gate sends a signal. If not, it doesn't. These faulty gates allow you to create probabilities for a wiring signal to be sent. If you've got 3 on lamps and 1 off lamp, then you have a 75% chance of that signal being sent. You can also make those odds variable because you can turn those lamps on and off. The key difference between a faulty logic gate and a normal logic gate is that faulty logic gates don't turn on and off. A regular AND gate will send a signal when it activates and when it deactivates. A faulty gate only sends a signal once. There's no deactivation. That means a faulty lamp above a single regular lamp serves as a self-contained if statement. We can use faulty lamps for probabilities, and the most important probabilities are 1 and 0. If this lamp is off, nothing happens. If the lamp is on, a signal is guaranteed to go through. That's it. If you just want to put a check to block an input unless another condition is met, use a faulty logic gate. There are also 2 other wiring tools, Junction and pixel boxes. A J-box lets you put wires of the same color next to each other without them overlapping. You can hammer it to change where the wires connect, left to right, left to up, and left to down. These are useful in dense wiring builds or a situation where you need multiple overlapping wire paths and can't afford different color wrenches. In a non-wiring context, though, they can be placed anywhere without supporting blocks, and you can build off of them with platforms. A pixel box acts like a junction box, but as a block. They only activate when they receive wiring signals from both wiring paths, and they light up. They're mostly useful for making adaptive screens, like when making an animation. So those are all the basic building blocks of wiring, but we can't just jump straight into building something like this. There are a lot of ways to combine all of these building blocks into different circuits which you can piece together into a bigger build. Let's go over a few. We talked about using timers to delay an input and sending a signal back to deactivate the timer. It's much simpler to do that with a logic gate. We can also use logic gates to multiply signals being sent, that is, immediately follow up a signal with a second or a third. Normally, a logic gate can only send a signal once per input. If we set up a situation where the logic gate would feed back into itself and cause another signal, or the signal otherwise would cause the logic gate to activate again, it fails, changing its state but sending out smoke instead. Building something like this, where the input connects to the output, the logic gate, and the lamp, causes the input to get doubled, meaning a second signal is sent out in the same game tick. To triple the input, or do even more, we need to add more logic gates. If we have a situation where we have multiple signals going down a wire at one time and we want to reduce that number, we can use what's called a diode. A diode is a device that only allows a signal to pass through it in one direction. A logic gate with one lamp does that. We run our wire with multiple signals into it, but the puff of smoke comes out and only lets through the first one. The difference between the doubler and the limiter is that we switch to a different color of wire. Switching wire colors like that is another useful thing you can do with a diode. You can run into problems, especially when using timers, where a signal is getting sent down your whole wire and activating multiple things instead of just what you want. By breaking up your wire colors with diodes, you can prevent signals from going backwards. In this case, we shoot this pressure plate to turn on a timer to activate this platform after half a second, which also turns on a timer to shut it off after another second. If we didn't use diodes, the timers would reactivate each other every time they activated and cause the platform to get stuck turning on and off. Since timers are both an input and an output, using diodes like this lets us separate what they output to and where their inputs come from by only letting the signal pass through it one way. This half-second timer will send a signal to the 1-second timer, but the 1-second timer signal can't pass backwards to do the same. Diodes can also be used to delay wiring signals, and I talk more about that later. We can use faulty gates as diodes too. The advantage here is that we can keep using the same wire color and we can shut off this lamp to disable the diode. That's what's called a transistor. Essentially, a secondary signal is controlling a gateway to let through the main signal. When the lamp is on, the faulty lamp has a 100% chance of activation. When it's off, it has a 0% chance. Faulty logic gates are not the only transistors. Using the puff of smoke failsafe mechanism from earlier and a doubled signal, we can create a transistor with regular logic gates. We're going to send a doubled signal to a lamp on a second logic gate. The gate will fire when the other lamps are on, and it will reset itself to an off state immediately. The benefit here is that you can have more than one lamp in the transistor. A faulty transistor only works with one lamp, whereas an AND logic gate could have any number of conditions to be met. We can use transistors to make a reset switch. We want to connect the lamp in a faulty logic gate to something that has a toggleable state. A light source, an actuated block, a logic gate lamp, or something similar. When it's on, the lamp turns on. Then, when we press the master reset button, it hits all of the lamps that are on to turn everything off. Essentially, we're only activating the faulty gates that are already on with this switch, and they turn themselves off. You can also do this with the smoky transistors. These are a bit more flexible since the wire can go vertically above the logic gate. With the faulty transistors, doing that would hit the faulty lamp. For building reset switches, you want to have a line of transistors that keep track of what's been activated. In this case here, you can see that we start with the top row all on and the bottom row all off. Every time we activate a gate on top, it sends a signal to the next faulty gate and the one beneath it. This bottom row is our reset line. You can see that their lamps correspond to the torches beneath them, so when we flip the switch, we only turn off the torches that have already been turned on. They also send a signal upward to toggle the gates of our counters. They have the exact same output of the binary counter above them, so they undo everything that one did. Reset switches can get a lot more complicated as we get to more advanced builds, but the core concept is the same. Keep track of what's been activated and undo all of those changes at once. Let's say we want a circuit that will only activate once, perhaps a door that stays open when opened and does not close. We could use a very bare-bones setup with an AND gate with one lamp on to start with. When the gate activates, it turns off its own lamp, preventing reactivation. The problem with this is that it's hardwired to only ever work once. So, let's put in a reset switch. We wire up two faulty gates, and each one both toggles the other's lamp and the output. This is called a set-reset circuit. It does exactly what it sounds like. You set some state in an object, and that doesn't change until you hit the reset button. Remember, we can space our wires apart to spread the two gates as far apart as we want them. Here, we have an input wired up to both the faulty lamp and the toggleable one below it. This will send out a signal every other activation. We'll need to use these for counting in binary later, but we can use them for some simple tasks. For instance, let's say we wanted to send a signal every 6 seconds. We wire up a 3-second timer to this gate called a toggle flip-flop, and now we've effectively halved the frequency of the signals. We could chain into a second one to do it again, up to 12 seconds. Alternatively, we can hook up a bunch of timers that lead into each other, like this. The advantage here is that we can use timers of different lengths. Let's take a break and look at a design you can build now with everything that we've talked about. This is an entrance to a pyramid, one from Terraria, my modern development. There's an invisible teleporter in the entrance here, and in order to use it, the player needs to light both fires outside. To do that, we have a bunch of echo-coded teal pressure plates surrounding the campfires. When it's shot, the teal pressure plates send a signal to a faulty lamp, activating the campfire. When this happens, the faulty gate turns itself off so that subsequent shots don't do anything and toggles a lamp in an AND gate. When both campfires are lit, the AND gate fires, sending a signal to another AND gate. This one checks for the player's position with a player above sensor. If the player is standing in the correct spot and both campfires have been lit, we send an activation signal to a trap, which hits a teal pressure plate, which hits a timer, which shuts itself off and activates a teleporter, bringing the player inside. This convoluted delay system lets the player avoid getting instantly teleported upon touching the entrance and ensures that they have a moment to see the campfires get lit. This is a one-time activation. We don't have a reset mechanism in place because we don't really need one. By combining an actuated and painted teleporter with a player above sensor that leads to a logic gate, you can make seamless entrances to structures that require the player to do some task before entering. It could be flipping a switch or a pressure plate, shooting something, having a second player sitting in the correct spot, being at the right time of day, or having a large gem to put in a gem lock. And you could implement a reset mechanism too. it just isn't necessary for this build. If you just want the player to stand on the teleporter without doing some secondary activity, you can just hook up the player above sensor to a logic gate and a subsequent timer. Back to learning. How exactly does sending multiple signals in one game tick work? We talked about it earlier when we went over doublers. Terraria has an internal tick rate of 60, which means the game only updates 60 times per second. If we're doing something 2 or 3 times in one tick, what does that do? So far, what we've discussed has been under the assumption that there is only one signal at a time and each input is going to only one relevant output. But what happens here? When I hit this switch, 2 dart traps fire and hit 2 separate teal pressure plates at the exact same time. After they finish, is this torch going to stay on or will it turn off? It stays on. Both wiring signals hit it, one turns it off, then the other immediately turns it back on in the same tick. If we add a blue wire, that sends a third signal down, turning it off, and we could keep adding more signals. So, as we can see, wiring does a lot within the span of one game tick. Sending multiple signals causes the output to be activated multiple times before the game ever even updates. There's a particular order that the game calculates wiring activity in. This is what determines what happens when there are multiple inputs or outputs. Let's take this teleporter. Our switch has both red and blue wires connecting to it, but they lead to separate teleporters. Where do we end up? Well, we go down the red wire path because red wire has higher priority than blue. Whenever multiple wires would send a signal at the same time, they go in order of color priority: red, blue, green, and finally yellow. But let's say we hit it again to teleport back. We actually end up at the blue teleporter because the red wire activates, we get sent to the middle teleporter, and then the blue wire activates, sending us to the blue teleporter, all within one game tick. Wiring starts when an input causes a signal to be sent down a wire. Signals are sent in the order of their colors: red, blue, green, and yellow. Within a wire, the signal activates outputs along the path in order. We can see this with these announcement boxes. The one closest to the input activates first, and then the next ones. Pumps, teleporters, and logic gates do not directly get activated during this step. Instead, they get queued up for later. This is because these mechanisms would get extremely messy with multiple concurrent inputs or outputs. Once all of the wire colors have finished, pumps begin working. The first inlet pump begins moving liquid to the first outlet pump, and so on. Teleporters come next. Any teleporters linked to red wires activate, then blue, then green, then yellow. If multiple teleporters are connected to those wire colors, only the first and last ones to be hit by the wiring signal activate. Anything in the middle is ignored. Lastly, logic gates are handled. The lamps turn on and off like torches, but the gates themselves don't activate until now. Whenever a logic gate lamp gets toggled, its gate is marked to be checked during this step. If the lamps are still lit up correctly after all of the wires are handled, then we move on to here. There's a 2-step process for each gate that's flagged. If the gate is supposed to fire but has already sent a signal, it sends out smoke and does nothing. If the gate hasn't sent a signal and is supposed to, it sends one. This is also where faulty logic gates activate. This process repeats for every lamp that was hit, and the logic gates refresh their ability to activate once it completes. This is what prevents logic gates from looping into themselves and crashing the game. You might see people refer to wiring ticks or wiring frames. This is what they're talking about. In one wiring tick, all wires activate, then pumps, teleporters, and logic gates. With the more advanced builds, synchronizing when wiring signals get sent is pretty important to prevent smoke or to build receivers. This is what diodes are useful for. If you need to delay a signal by one wiring tick, put it through a diode. But the problem is, we can't see wiring ticks. It all happens before the game ever updates. To fix that, we can use the MechScope mod. This lets us see a slowed down version of the wiring process. It's quite helpful for debugging and understanding more complicated builds. After all this, you should have a sense of how wiring signals work when there are multiple inputs, outputs, or signals happening simultaneously. As we're getting to more advanced circuits, we'll need to understand binary counters and shift registers. A binary counter, well, counts in binary. Binary is a very simple system for representing numbers, a series of ones and zeros. We're going to count in binary by making a simple system where the output only changes from every second signal. We already talked about these earlier. We set up several of them in a row depending on how high we want to count. Finally, we add an output linked to the original switch that toggles on every press. Now, we can count. To count in binary, you change the final digit between 0 and 1. Whenever you change from a 1 back to a 0, you go to the next digit over and change that one between 1 and 0, and you continue that pattern. Think of it like counting from 0 to 10, where once you change from 9 to a 0, you add 1 the next digit over, except we're only going between 0 and 1. Each digit has an associated value, and they're multiplied by 2 each time. 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, and so on. Add together the values for each spot that has a 1 and ignore any that have zeros, and you've got your number. On its own, counting isn't very helpful. I mean, it's kinda cool, but you have to do math just to make sense of what you counted. But you can build a circuit to turn these into something easier to understand. I discuss those later. So, on to shift registers. They sound confusing, but all it means is shifting the lamp that's lit to the side whenever a new signal comes in. So, instead of the back and forth binary system, a shift register is basically counting one at a time. To make a shift register, you need a bunch of transistors sitting side by side. Each one should be wired up to shut itself off and activate the lamps of the next one. Then, put a switch that activates all of them at once. Sending a signal will cause the currently lit lamp to move to the right. Now, we have a moving signal. The problem is, right now we don't turn off the previous torch when we move. To fix that, we need to hook up each logic gate to the next one's output as well. Now, we can make a moving line of blocks. I'll use spikes. We've compacted the design, but we've still got the same connections here. Each gate shuts itself off and turns on the next lamp and activates its own row and the next row of spikes. With a timer as our input, it shifts automatically. Hook up a dummy engine at half speed and the spikes will go flying across the screen. Of course, we don't need to have all of our inputs connect in a straight line underneath the logic gates. Here, I moved them to a bunch of actuated blocks to jump between. Let's say I want the platforms to stay lit for slightly longer though. Give the player a moment to realize when they need to jump. Instead of hooking up each logic gate to the next one's actuators, I'm going to give each platform a shutoff mechanism using timers. I'm using logic gates as a diode to stop the timers from directly touching the platforms. They're each staying active for 1.75 seconds right now. The player has 3/4 of a second to recognize where and when to jump. And shifting doesn't stop there. We can go back and forth. All it takes is adding a second row that goes backwards, like this. We can even go in all 4 directions. This is a shift register that can take the signal up, down, left, or right. It uses AND gates and 2 lamps, one for the horizontal distance and one for the vertical, to determine where the signal is. On the sides are our 4 shifters, one for going right, left, up, and down. You'll want to space them out a bit more though if you're going to pull the wires out to somewhere else. You could make a multiplayer map where one player is controlling a platform's movement while another one has to ride it. Let's make a scrolling message next. We're going to wire up a shift register to move a word from right to left. Let's build from left to right. To start with, place down all of your faulty gates on the left-hand side, then repeat this design of switch, 3 torches, faulty gate. The switch is here to let us toggle which torches are on as we write our message. Keep all of your faulty gate lamps off for now. Repeat this wire design. It's the shift register pattern where a faulty gate turns itself off and toggles the next one. However, we are not wiring the gates themselves yet to avoid messiness when turning on the torches. Once you've got this design wired up, turn off torches to write the letters that you want. Now that we have our message, we can wire up the logic gates without issue. Lastly, I strongly suggest shadow painting everything involved here. Anytime you want to send a moving signal or have things activate in a particular order, shift register should be your go-to circuit. Here, I've set up 3 announcement boxes to play one after the other and then a door opens. It also has a reset button. You could use this to simulate talking to something or making sure the player gets a message before moving onward in an adventure map. In this build, we have a simple jukebox. Our shift register can go back and forth to select which music box to play, and an announcement box displays which song it is. Right now, our shift register has all of the faulty lamps wired up to the same input. If we give each one a different input, we can make a sequencer, a circuit to check that things happen in the correct order or sequence. As you can see, we need to hit each switch one at a time to have the signal pass through. If we press a switch when the lamp beneath it isn't lit, nothing happens. The switches have to be pressed in a specific order. With that sequencer concept, we can make passwords. Remember, we can pull the inputs to the side and wire them up to be in whatever order we want. You could just use the sequencer as is, but that can easily be brute forced. A player can just keep pressing switches until it moves forward. To stop that, we need a reset switch, one that'll be activated whenever the wrong input is given. A setup like this accomplishes that. We have 4 inputs, one for each wire color. You can see the code at the top. Whenever a color is entered, it triggers the faulty lamps up top, sending a signal downward. If the correct color is given, it activates this yellow wire, which turns off this lamp on the side. If the incorrect color is given, that lamp doesn't get turned off and a signal on the side hits a reset switch. With that, we can make a simple password that uses between 2 to 4 inputs. It can be as many digits as you want, just make the circuit longer. More complicated passwords are not something I'm going to describe in detail, but you can check the links in the description for some of these builds. This is a padlock that uses a grid of 10 possible numbers instead of the 2 to 4 inputs that we had, and the code can be set dynamically instead of being hardwired in. This one is similar, but it uses a dial. I glossed over something with one of those shift register builds. To get this message back to the right side, we need to send 5 signals back, but you'll notice that we're only using 2 wire colors and they connect to all 5 of our rows. How is that possible? There are 2 ways that we can send multiple signals, in parallel or serialized. Parallel signals means sending them down separate wires side by side. The problem is, the larger your build is, the more wire that takes, the more space it takes, and the messier it gets. Serial transmissions are sent down the same wire. You can think of this like an actual computer. You're not using separate wires for every single piece of data. That would very quickly become implausible. The problem is that serial transmission of data is much more complicated to set up. We know how sending multiple signals down a wire works. It all has a specific order that it goes in. To set up a serial transmission, we need a very specifically timed circuit. This is one, and I know it's scary, but we'll take it piece by piece. We have our input switches, our output torches, and a transmission switch. Pressing any of the input switches will turn on a lamp in the associated faulty gate, and when we press the transmission switch, that'll cause the corresponding torch on the bottom to turn on. Let's assume the first and third switches have been hit, but not the second. Everything starts when we hit the transmission button. I'm going to break this down step by step in order. First, the switch hits the green wires. This toggles the lamp above the second AND gate and hits the faulty lamp for the third switch. However, if you remember the wiring priority, we don't activate logic gates until all of the wire colors have finished. So, before either of those gates fire, we go down the yellow wire. This hits the faulty lamps below, but they haven't had their lamps beneath them turned on, so it doesn't do anything to them. The only thing it does is toggle this lamp here. Now we activate the gates. We start with the red wire on the bottom. This toggles these 2 lamps on. Now, if a signal comes down the yellow wire, it'll cause torch 3 to turn on. We go back to the yellow wires now. The signal from the third faulty gate up top comes through, and the bottom lamp is ready to receive that input. Because this logic gate already sent a signal, it doesn't pulse a second time. The torch doesn't turn on just yet, but it's queued up to happen. While that's happening, the second AND gate up top sends a signal down its wire. It toggles this lamp on and tries to activate the faulty lamp beneath it. However, because the second switch was off, nothing happens. Now we go back to the logic gates. The bottom gate that we just activated fires off a signal, deactivating this lamp in the faulty gate and activating the next one. It also turns the lamp for the first logic gate on. We go to the green wire on the faulty gate, it activates, and the torch turns on. Right now, if another signal came through, it would turn on the second torch. But there isn't a signal because the lamp up top was off. We cycle through to the first input, and by now that faulty gate was deactivated and the next one becomes ready. The signal comes through, turning the first torch on. We end with an extra gate to turn off the last lamp on the bottom to keep all of our lamps off. And this can be scaled to whatever size you need. The cycle will keep repeating. This isn't the only way to do serial transmission. You can use a compact design like this to save space, for instance. Earlier, we briefly discussed making an engine to send a signal every single game tick using NPCs or target dummies. And we mentioned delaying timers a bit, but there's a lot more to go over, so let's talk timing. We have our basic timers that we buy from the mechanic, very straightforward. As we saw earlier, we can have them using flip-flop circuits, or we can chain timers side by side to delay them. They are great for longer delays or anything that's a multiple of a quarter second. But what about faster than a quarter second, or something that doesn't divide in neatly? We had the dummy engine earlier, which activated every game tick, or 60 times per second. We can have that by removing one of the pressure plates. That gets us down to 30 per second. We could then use flip-flops to get them down to 15, and if we needed a more specific timing, we could make a binary counter that only sends a signal after reaching a certain number. But it's simpler to just use the distance traveled by a consistent projectile as a timer. Dart traps, spear traps, the portal gun, there are a few options. We'll talk about the binary timers later when we go over decoders. Dart traps travel at a speed of 45 tiles per second and have an exceedingly long range, as the projectile survives for a full minute, traveling for 2,700 blocks. This means if you place a teal pressure plate at exactly the right distance, you can use that dart as a timer for any length less than a minute, and for more than a minute, you'll just need multiple traps. The problem here, of course, is you need to know what that distance is, and physically count it out. The first thing to know is that darts do not spawn at the dart trap, they spawn one block in front of it. If you're counting how far the dart is traveling, you need to start here, not here. We said they move at 45 blocks per second. We could also look at this as traveling 0.75 blocks in a single frame. Extrapolating from that, we can work out specific timings. Take the duration that you want, anything from 1 to 3,600 ticks, and multiply it by 0.75. Then round to the nearest number. 0.25 rounds down and 0.75 rounds up. If you have a 0.5 value, then the dart trap cannot activate at that duration. You need to do some workarounds. Finally, add 1 for that offset I was talking about earlier. So, if we want 1 frame, we use 2 blocks. For 33 frames, we use 26 blocks. For 60 frames, 46 blocks. This holds true all the way up to 3,600 frames at 2,701 blocks, which is the maximum range of the dart trap. Keep in mind that dart traps have a cooldown of 3.333 seconds. If you want to have a dart trap that perfectly loops itself once it comes off cooldown, you need to have a pressure plate 152 blocks away. I don't know exactly why, but it's 1 more block than you would expect from the calculations. It needs to be 201 frames from the activation instead of 200. So we can use a dart trap to time out basically any interval of time, but that's pretty time consuming to build and it's very space intensive. But it's also very simple and easy to adjust. You just change the pressure plate's distance. We can also use a dart trap as a simple engine. It won't activate every game tick unless we throw in some extra help, but a line of teal pressure plates that loops to reactivate the trap after 152 blocks will create a looping engine that keeps sending out signals pretty fast. Spear traps are another way to time things out. They have a maximum range of 20 blocks and work nice and cleanly. The spear travels at a speed of half a block per tick, so the first pressure plate that can be triggered is 2 blocks away after 1 tick, then every additional block adds 2 ticks. They're not as versatile as dart traps, but they are a lot cleaner to work with. We can combine multiple traps to reach durations that we can't get evenly. For instance, putting 2 dart traps together like this makes a signal after 2 ticks, which we can't get with just 1. Here's an example of a situation where I'd want to use this. I want to give the appearance of a moving spike trap. I've got actuators on top of spikes and want them to turn on in order, then turn themselves off after a short delay, then loop that movement. And we don't need to use a single logic gate to do that. I have a series of spear traps here. You could use dart traps too, but spear traps have a shorter cooldown of only 1.5 seconds, which is better for this. We start with a bunch of spear traps that chain into each other by hitting a pressure plate. In addition to activating the next spear, each pressure plate goes off to the side and hits a trap that activates a row of spikes. At the end of the chain, the last spear loops back to reactivate the first one. Next up is the deactivation. We pull each signal that goes to the actuators upwards and put down a few more spear traps, depending on how long we want the delay to be. We end with a wire that goes down to the actuators to turn them back off. We also need to use junction boxes here to avoid overlapping our wires. Overall, dart and spear traps are a very simple to use system that allows you to adjust timings to whatever you want. Just remember that they do have cooldowns. There's one more type of engine I'd like to cover, and that is a crab engine. Really, this works for any fighter type enemy. Crabs are just the fastest because of their height. Since we have quarter-second timers and all this other stuff now, that doesn't help that much for most things. They are helpful if you're downpatching to an older game version. In 1.4, though, they can be used for an effective and easy-to-set-up engine before fighting Skeletron. This is mostly just useful for statue farming because it sets up an automatic system that will spawn enemies from statues. Put down a fighter-type enemy, you can put in as many as you want, but statues have a cooldown of half a second, so you don't need that many. 3 is plenty. Pop down a red pressure plate, which you can find in naturally occurring statue traps, and connect it with natural wire to a statue you want to farm. Now you can just sit back and AFK for whatever you want. Okay, so using all of these projectiles, we can time pretty much anything from 60 signals per second or slower. But what about faster? As we saw, we can send multiple wiring signals in a single tick, and we can make an engine to do that. The simplest way is just to stack multiple dummies into a dummy engine. If one dummy activates 60 times per second, slapping a second one in there will do 120 per second. Now, getting a second dummy in there is complicated without glitches. The easiest method is just to use the teleporter glitch we mentioned earlier for statues. Put the dummy on a teleporter and then break the block underneath the teleporter. This will cause the dummy to float and the invisible dummy NPC to fall down. Stack as many as you want, but be warned that doing a ton of wiring in one game tick can cause some lag. Okay, well, what about something that doesn't take up a bunch of space and doesn't have to deal with cooldowns? Let's step back to that whole binary thing. We can set up an exact timer using our binary counters. Let's make a setup to activate every 5 ticks, or 12 times per second. We're going to use a dummy engine to send out a signal every tick, then use our binary counters to delay it. Then, at the end, we use a reset switch that triggers when our signal is sent out to bring us back to 0. That reset circuit is also linked up to the dummy engine's activation switch to make sure we always start at 0. All that we're doing here is counting to 4. Once we hit 4, we turn on this gate, which activates once the next signal comes in on frame 5. Then, our signal gets through, it turns itself back off, and we use our reset circuit to go back to 0. A circuit like this lets you control the speed of the timer with a switch between a few presets. Using our dummy engine, we can also utilize hoiks to vary our signal speed. Each additional hoik tooth we add in here increases the duration between signals by 1 tick. We can also add in a shift register to delay our timer speed. This lets us divide by numbers other than 2. There are all sorts of options here, and there's not a better or worse one. Each one has advantages and disadvantages. In some cases, the advantage is just being easy to remember and easy to adjust. So we know how to count in binary. The problem is, this is not intuitive. We don't understand numbers in binary. We understand numbers in base 10. We have a code here, and we can decrypt it by looking at it and working it out, or we can make a circuit to do that for us. We're going to be taking a binary number and turning it into a decimal one, something we can just read, like 5. So we need something that can decode binary into decimal. In order to do that, we need a lot of pieces. We need some system to uniquely identify each number. If we wanted to send a signal for the number 5, we need to make sure that that signal only gets sent when we have the number 5. To do that, we need to build a decoder. This is a decoder. Every single logic gate here represents a different number, 0 through 7. Depending on what code we give it, it activates a different logic gate and sends a different signal. We're basically doing addition here. Each row is adding 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, and so on in multiples of 2. As you can see, we start with 0. If we want 1, we send a signal in the bottom row, adding 1. If we want 6, we add 2 and 4. Let's go over that again, just to be clear. These lamps are a code for different numbers, 0 through 7, and when the correct code is given, it activates the logic gate. We use rows of wire to add either 1, 2, or 4. One signal in the middle adds 2, which gives us 2. Sending a signal down each wire adds up to 7. To go higher than 7, you just add another row and double the number of gates. The exact pattern here is important, but it's just counting in binary. The first row has 1 lamp on, then 1 off. The second has 2 on, then 2 off. The third has 4 on, 4 off. The fourth would have 8 on, 8 off, and it just keeps going like that. Right now, we're just using switches to send those signals. The next step is to hook this up to our binary counter. Instead of each logic gate going down to a torch, it's going to go down to the correct row in the decoder. As you can see, whenever we flip the switch, we can count up by 1, and we loop back once we finish. So we've got our binary counter, and we have a system to send a signal for each number. We can now send a signal that means 5. Let's just hook it up to a number statue. We light up the associated number, and we can immediately understand our binary counter. But there's a pretty glaring problem with this decoder. We can send a signal for 5, sure, but do you notice all the smoke that's coming out from the other gates? As we saw earlier when we talked about smoky transistors, smoke happens when a logic gate would fire multiple times from one signal. In this case, we're flipping a switch, the red wire pulses out and turns on the first logic gate, and then the blue wire turns it back off. At the end, we have the gate off, but we lose the second signal that should have been sent and smoke comes out instead. That means that instead of turning the torch on and then immediately back off, it stays on. Our whole decoding process is useless if we're accidentally sending the wrong signals. To solve this, we need to go back to the order of operations for wiring. If you remember from back then, we go wires, pumps, teleporters, logic gates. Whenever we toggle a lamp on a logic gate, that gate gets queued up to be checked after all of the other wires have run their course. If we queue up a logic gate, it activates, and then the next batch of wires gets activated, we get our smoke popping out and the decoder breaks. What we need to do is send all of our signals to the decoder in the same wiring tick. In this setup, the red signal happens immediately, but the blue signal is delayed because it's stuck behind a logic gate. We need to delay our red signal by 1 logic gate. And there we have it. We don't get smoke anymore. The logic gate lamp gets hit, but before the gate ever gets updated, we turn it back off. But we still have another logic gate left, and this one is delayed by 2 logic gates. We can't just add a second gate to the red wire, because then we'd have 2 gates for the red signal, 1 for the blue, and 2 for the green. But we could add a red gate and a blue gate. Now our decoder works perfectly. It's not the most elegant solution, but it does work. You can add any number of extra gates to go through before reaching the decoder. Currently, our binary counter only goes up, but we can add additional features. We can count up, down, in both directions, add a reset button, and more. One at a time though. Subtraction first. Let's add a -1 button. To do that, we need to add a secondary counter that's going in the opposite direction. Here's our basic binary counter from earlier. We're going to add an extra diode on the bottom to avoid crossing wire colors since we're adding quite a bit here. This works just like the binary counter we already made. Now we add the subtraction circuit. Normally, we put our lamps on to start with, but for counting backwards, we're going to have them off. Connect the subtraction circuit to the next logic gates just like the addition circuit. Next, we're going to connect the subtraction circuit to turn on the AND gates down below. Both the addition and subtraction circuit are able to turn the torches on and off now. We're almost there. The last step is connecting the addition and subtraction lamps. Each input that goes to toggle the lamp of the addition circuit should also go to the lamp of the subtraction circuit and vice versa. We pull the red and blue wires up to the top lamp and the green and yellow wires down to the bottom lamp. Make sure not to connect to the faulty lamp, only the one that toggles on and off. And there we go. Hook this up to our decoder, and now we can go in both directions. We're counting from 0 to 15 now, so the decoder is a bit bigger. However, we still have the smoke issue, so we need to delay our signals. Our slowest signal doesn't need to be delayed, but each of the ones before it needs to be delayed by an extra step to compensate. Okay, let's add a reset switch next. We're going to rewire things a bit because adding a reset switch in as is would be pretty messy. As we get to adding more features, using the basic binary counter setup gets trickier. We've got a reset switch and our reset circuit, our addition circuit, and our subtraction circuit. It's all wired up so that the reset circuit keeps track of which of the lamps above it are turned on and turned off and sends out a signal to undo them. The key difference in our wiring now is that we're separating which of the wires toggle the lamps and which ones activate the gates. In this build, the red wire does both, but that means that the reset switch won't work because it'll cause the faulty gates to activate. In our new design, the red wires only toggle the lamps while a yellow wire activates the gates. That is what lets us reset the counter. For the last step, we need to delay our signals before reaching the decoder, and we need to do a little extra for the reset button. The problem is our reset switch activates all of its circuits at once, so it needs its own separate delay system. It's a bit messy and needs some junction boxes. I'm not very good with planning out builds. These are just a few possible binary counters of many. You can make them count much higher, give them extra features like switches to select your starting number, and you can make them much more compact. But I'm sick of talking about building them. Let's talk about using them. Remember that shift register with the scrolling message? Well, we can use our binary counter to set the scrolling speed that we want. Unlike dart traps, we don't have to worry about a cooldown or taking up a ton of space, and unlike timers, we can do it faster than every quarter second. One of the more obvious uses of a counter is counting, like score, or the number of times that something happened. A simple one can just use a torch or gemspark block underneath the decoder and go up. If you wanted a back and forth counter like Inscription's score system, you can make it two-way. But we can also display a binary counter's output in a cleaner way using our decoder and a display circuit. These are the same sort of things you see at sports games. You have the 7 lines that light up depending on the numbers. All that we need to do is line up each of the decoder's logic gates to the correct part of the display. I'm going to add a row of permanently on lamps to our decoder to let us use all 4 wire colors here, and I'm going to space them out slightly. This is because a compact design is quite challenging to wire up. And yeah, that's about it for binary counter uses. I mean, you're just counting. If you need to count, use a counter. I will fully acknowledge that this is a wiring nightmare. I am not very good at making clean designs, and this cannot be scaled easily. The whole 7-segment display idea is pretty cool though, and there are much better ways to execute it. Right now, we're just wiring up each number to directly try to turn on everything it needs. The problem is that very quickly becomes messy, implausible, and takes up a ton of space. This is only 8 numbers. What we really need to do is use a different decoder. The decoder we've been using takes us from a binary number to a decimal number. Decimal numbers are what we know and use, but decimal numbers don't play nicely with all the extra wiring output. What we need is to turn our binary input into a string of numbers that we can easily work with, and to do that, we need a binary coded decimal number. Basically, and I'm really leaning heavily on the word basically there, every single number that we show on our display screen can be represented by a unique string of bits. 1s and 0s are binary numbers. However, we want to display a decimal output. Binary coded decimal is a way to represent each decimal digit in binary, which we can output to a display, then chain those together to make our full decimal numbers. Instead of reading a giant string of numbers in binary, like 97, we're using a decoder to convert it to the hundreds, tens, and 1 digits, then reading those in order. 9, then 7, not 97. This circuit is pretty complicated. We're also starting to use XOR gates here. I'm not going to go into detail on why why exactly these work the way they do or how the number conversions work, you can go read up on the double-dabble algorithm if you're interested in the conversion process. This is basically a scoreboard, or a counter. It works in one direction with a reset button, and if you want a longer number, you can just extend it left. Okay, we're dabbling with the idea of taking our signals and turning them into something visually. They can change depending on how many signals have been sent, and by using a binary timer, we can set an exact frame duration between changes. Building off of that, we can make animations. The simplest way is just by using text chat and announcement boxes. Remember how we could color announcement box messages in chat earlier? Well, if we give that color code to a box Unicode character in chat, then the box gets colored. And if we set up multiple announcement boxes to get triggered in a row, we can essentially make a screen and then change what's on it. Typing Unicode characters can vary depending on your keyboard and operating system, but for me, I hold down Alt, then hit 219. Once I let go of Alt, we have our block. You can do this directly in Terraria, but I suggest typing all of your messages out in Word or Notepad and then copy and pasting it in. There are a bunch of different Unicode characters you can type out and change the color of. Hold down Alt and start pressing numbers and you'll see them, but we're just going to use this block. We can adjust the size of our screen by adding rows and columns. Text chat will display 10 rows at once, so that's your maximum height. If you want something smaller than 10 rows, start your announcement box with an empty line. Just press Shift-Enter. This will ensure that the old message gets pushed off screen and the blocks stay in a consistent location. For each frame of your animation, decide which color each box should be. You can play around with things easily by importing a screenshot of your uncolored chat box into a photo editing software, then trying different hexadecimal colors for the different boxes. If you're on mobile or console, unfortunately, this character doesn't show up in chat. This bug may be patched at some point, but as of right now, this is only doable on PC. If you're making a large animation, the character limit for announcement boxes is gonna show up to cause trouble. It's 1,193 for one announcement box. The thing is, this includes all of the hexadecimal color tag information that gets hidden in the actual message. Because of that, if you want a tall and wide screen, you'll need to organize multiple announcement boxes to be sent at the same time, going down the same wire one after another. Lastly, you just need to wire up the announcement boxes to play in order with whatever timing you want between messages. This is pretty janky though. The benefit is that it can be in color, but what about an animation with blocks that we can see moving in-game? You might have seen videos like these, and yeah, it's possible, but very intensive. Making these animations comes down to knowing how to use pixel boxes. Like I described earlier, they're a junction box in block form. When they receive a signal horizontally and vertically simultaneously, they light up. It doesn't actually produce light, it's more like a lumen encoding. Doing it again turns them off. So, we want to put all of our wire colors into a grid and selectively send a signal down 2 of them at once to turn the boxes we want on. That means we want each of our input switches to have 2 wires and to make sure the only spot those wires overlap is at the box for that switch. You can see an 8x8 grid example of that here, just keep scaling the pattern of wires for larger boxes. The tricky part now is to designate which boxes turn on and when. We have to light up the correct inputs on the correct frame of the animation, then change those inputs on the next frame. You're going to very quickly run into problems if you just try to directly wire them up. It's going to be a mess trying to avoid wire overlap. We need to basically build a computer, and I'm not going to teach you how to do that. But I don't need to. You can use a template world and play around in that. This world is called Animation Studio and was made by some quite talented people. It's a 24x24 grid of pixel boxes, and you can set and save each frame yourself with these switches, up to 4,096 frames. It's pretty simple to use, but Terraria animations are a nightmare. This is going to be unplayably laggy, in my experience. I don't have the strongest PC, but there is an obscene amount of wiring that's being done every frame here. And you can download a pre-processing mod to take the strain off of calculating them immediately. It's hosted on GitHub, and it's kind of playable like that as long as you keep the animation frame rate low, but it's still not great. There are also template worlds for larger animations, 120x68 and 144x96. The problem only gets worse with those, but you can make larger animations. For those, there are tools to convert videos into binary and import them into Terraria rather than coding the frames by hand, but it's going to take a bit of effort and I'm not going to go over that here. The instructions can be found linked in the description. Being able to store data is very important as you get to highly advanced circuitry, and you have 2 main methods of that: RAM and ROM. RAM, random access memory, is temporary and can be overwritten. We use what's called a D flip-flop to store data, which is remembered until we want it to change. This is your basic RAM cell, which can store 2 bits of data at once. The Animation Studio map uses huge swaths of RAM to function. Remember, we can set and change the animation in-game, so we need something we can write to. ROM, read-only memory, is permanent and cannot be changed without rebuilding the circuit. Because we only need to read it, it's much more compact. This is what the larger animation displays use. In fact, the process of making these videos is just reducing what you want to play into a bunch of low-resolution black and white images, then turning those into a string of binary numbers, then importing those binary codes as lamps into the ROM circuitry. ROM works by stacking additional faulty lamps above a single one. Faulty gates only count the lamps that are lit before the first faulty gate. By stacking additional lamps like this, we keep the same activation chances but enable additional input locations. Due to time constraints, I'm not going to go into much more detail on memory and data storage. There are additional resources linked in the description if you'd like to learn more. Lastly, the final concept for us to touch on are randomizers. Remember earlier how I said faulty logic gates could be used to give you a chance to send a signal and then completely ignored that until now when we've only been using one lamp? Well, we can put more lamps on there. The faulty gate will select a lamp at random from underneath it, and if it's on, it sends a signal. This alone lets us assign probabilities to an event. Here, we have a 50% chance of activating these heart statues. If that fails, we activate a trap instead. Gambling. Using multiple and a little ingenuity, we can build circuits to give us one of several random outputs. These two designs will pick one of the outputs at random and send a single signal to them. This, meanwhile, sends a signal out at random, but also sends a deactivation signal to the previous location. Those are all of the building blocks I wanted to cover. To end this video, let's look at some more applications. Exploits are an incredibly helpful way to utilize wiring. I'm quite fond of the flare gun projectile cap exploit. It takes very easy to find items and minimal effort. However, it's not the most effective way of reaching the projectile cap. Using furniture that spawns projectiles, we can make a circuit that reaches it automatically and loops itself. There are a few ways we can do that. Stack 30 cannons on top of each other at the top of the world, which fire straight upward and fall into a elevator. This ensures that the projectiles will stay in the world for long enough. Build a shift register to activate each one in order. We connect each one to its own lamp and the lamp of the next one. Make a dummy engine to provide inputs and turn it on. Give it a little time to spawn enough cannonballs and then you're good to go. You'll want to summon your minions if you want to use this for bosses, obviously, but nothing will be able to spawn any projectiles. However, I do believe this method is getting patched in 1.4.5, so let's check another one. We can use dart traps with the same basic idea. We put them side by side and activate them in order. We also want to turn the dart traps off with actuators to prevent them from blocking the other shots. The problem is, you do need a lot of dart traps, more than you'll reasonably have unless you're playing on no traps or get fixed boy. Enemy spawning, as well, can be broken in half with wiring. By lining 30 critter statues up in a pool of lava and activating each one, in order, every game tick, we prevent the game from being able to spawn any enemies. This is because only one standard NPC can spawn per tick, and if we spawn an NPC from a statue every tick, then nothing else can show up. This works over any distance. This is not the same as reaching the NPC cap. You can still get bosses or enemies that show up under special conditions, like how ghosts show up from tombstones. If it has special spawning circumstances, it can still appear. But if you've got this circuit build, you are free to go about the world and almost nothing can spawn to bother you. And don't dig up and get fixed boy, you'll have to keep the statues far enough away that they despawn, as the lava won't kill them instantly. Using critters that don't transform during blood moons is best. Speaking of blood moons, you can also just keep spawning bunnies and goldfish during blood moons to race up to the NPC limit. By using teleporters and understanding enemy spawn requirements, you can make some very effective foams. There was the Lucky Coin Spider foam that Quasar and DinoChess made and Mappy improved upon, but I believe that is getting patched in 1.4.5. There are a lot of impractical but very cool foams. This is one that mass produces gel from slime statues and collects thousands of gel per second. There are gnome foams to rapidly generate gnomes and all sorts of critter foams, but most of those aren't really that useful. They're just kind of cool. These are just some of many possible designs, and this video has been going on for long enough at this point. There are some wiring concepts I wasn't able to cover, circuits that are pretty much only useful for very advanced designs, like multiplexers, demultiplexers, RAM and ROM, and a few others. And you can use Terraria's wiring to make a massive number of things, from scoreboards and puzzles to fully functional games like Tetris, calculators, and computers. Remember that Discord server I mentioned earlier in the video, the Grand Designers? In making this video, I received a lot of help from some very knowledgeable people, many of whom are in that server. SpeakQZ, Quasar, Echinator, J, YFD, and more. Many of the designs in this video were made or inspired by what they've built. In that server, I'm going to be managing some events for the next 2 months. Starting today, we'll be hosting building events with actual prizes. You can win Steam games, roles, and I'll be featuring winners in an upcoming video. Plus, we'll have categories for amateur and advanced builders, so less experienced people can win as well. The first event, running for 2 weeks from today, will be to make a short adventure map using wiring for platforming, puzzles, or minigames in each room. I'd highly suggest checking it out and participating. There are also a number of written guides that I'll link in the description. I did not write these and am not affiliated with them, but they are additional resources you can look through for more information. Be warned that they may not be the easiest to understand, either due to technical jargon or translation difficulties. I have put a lot of time and effort into trying to understand all this stuff and put it in an understandable format, but I can't cover everything, and I glossed over a lot of the more technical details. Also, if you are an experienced builder, coder, or spriter and want to help work on my Terra Cells mod, please reach out to me on Discord. But for now, that's all I've got.